war that most Americans have never heard about in detail, yet one that set the course for everything that followed. A war that gave a young George Washington his first taste of command and his first bitter defeat. A war that determined which empire would dominate North America, and a war whose consequences planted the seeds of revolution in the very colonies it was fought to defend. How is it that this conflict, the French and Indian War, remains overshadowed in our memory when it might just be the single most important prelude to American independence? Tonight, we uncover the story of the war that made America. To understand the French and Indian War, we need to step back into the early 1700s and picture the vast, untamed continent of North America, a place not yet divided into the neat borders we know today. Along the Atlantic coast lay the British colonies, 13 in number, stretching from New England down to Georgia. These colonies were growing quickly, filled with over 1 million settlers, farmers, tradesmen, and merchants, each pushing steadily westward in search of new land and opportunity. Across the northern expanse lay New France, a sprawling and lightly populated domain, extending from the St. Lawrence River and Quebec, through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi Valley to Louisiana. The French were fewer in number, perhaps only around 70,000 colonists, but they possessed something the British lacked: an intricate web of alliances with native nations, connections forged through decades of fur trade, intermarriage, and diplomacy. To the south and west, Spain still held vast lands, though it played only a background role in the northern struggle. The most coveted prize was the Ohio River Valley, a rich basin of rivers, forests, and fertile soil. For the British, this valley represented expansion, new farms, trade, and wealth. For the French, it was the critical link that bound their northern territories to their Louisiana colony, a highway of water routes that secured their empire. And for the native nations, it was home, sacred ground, and the heart of their sovereignty. The Iroquois Confederacy, a powerful league of nations that had long balanced French and British influence, tried to play both sides to preserve independence. Other tribes like the Shawnee, Miami, and Delaware watched uneasily as more settlers arrived, recognizing that whoever controlled the valley would ultimately threaten their way of life. The stakes were immense. Empires looked at the Ohio Valley and saw territory. Native peoples looked at it and saw survival. Colonists looked at it and saw opportunity. And all three visions collided in a way that would spark one of the most decisive wars of the 18th century. The first sparks of the conflict came not from parliaments or royal edicts, but from the actions of a young colonial officer in the Pennsylvania wilderness. In 1753, Virginia's governor sent a 21-year-old George Washington into the Ohio Valley to deliver a warning to the French: withdraw from land claimed by Britain or face consequences. The French politely refused, and by 1754, Washington returned at the head of a small militia force. It was here, in the dense forests near present-day Pittsburgh, that destiny came calling. Washington ambushed a French scouting party near Jumonville Glen. The skirmish was small, lasting only minutes, but it ended with Ensign Jumonville dead under circumstances that remain debated to this day. Was he killed in combat or executed by native allies after surrendering? Whatever the truth, the French considered it an assassination, while the British treated it as proof of French aggression. Washington, barely more than a boy by military standards, suddenly found himself at the center of a storm. Knowing retaliation was inevitable, he hurriedly constructed a crude palisade called Fort Necessity. Within weeks, French forces and their native allies descended upon it. The battle was chaotic. Rain poured down, soaking powder, and Washington's inexperienced militia faltered under the assault. After a day of fighting, Washington was forced to surrender. Humiliated, he signed terms written in French, which he did not fully understand, inadvertently admitting to the assassination of Jumonville. This single document would echo across the Atlantic. It was the first and only time Washington would surrender in his entire military career. But more importantly, his actions had lit the fuse of a global war. In that muddy Pennsylvania meadow, a young man who would one day lead a revolution, instead, delivered the opening blow in a struggle that engulfed the world. The irony is striking. Had Washington not attacked, perhaps the French and Indian War, and maybe even the American Revolution, might never have unfolded as they did. What followed Washington's blunder was a terrifying period of frontier warfare. The French, though far fewer in settlers, wielded the advantage of native alliances. Their partners, Huron, Ottawa, Algonquin, and many others, knew the forests, rivers, and trails intimately. Together, they launched raids along the British frontier, burning homesteads, ambushing travelers, and forcing thousands of settlers to flee eastward. For colonial families living on the edge of Pennsylvania or Virginia, this was not a distant imperial war. It was a nightmare at their doorstep. One of the darkest moments came in 1755, when Britain sent General Edward Braddock with a force of redcoats and colonial militia to seize Fort Duquesne. Washington, eager to redeem himself, rode as an aide-de-camp. Braddock, however, dismissed colonial warnings about fighting in the woods. He insisted on marching in rigid European formations, drums beating, banners flying. The result was disaster. As the column advanced, French soldiers and native warriors unleashed a devastating ambush from the cover of the forest. Chaos erupted. The disciplined ranks crumbled. Soldiers panicked, fled, and were cut down. Braddock himself was mortally wounded. The British force was annihilated. Washington, miraculously unharmed despite bullets ripping through his coat and killing 2 horses beneath him, distinguished himself by rallying the survivors and leading them to safety. This moment became legendary, cementing his reputation as a man of destiny. Yet for the colonies, the defeat was catastrophic. It showed that Britain's mighty army could be humbled on American soil, and it left settlers exposed to years of relentless frontier attacks. For native nations allied with France, this was proof of their strength. For the British colonists, it was proof that they could not rely solely on distant generals or rigid European tactics. The war was becoming something new, not just a clash of empires, but a brutal struggle where survival depended on adaptation. By 1757, things looked grim for Britain. French forces dominated the interior. Native allies kept colonial settlements under siege. But then came a turning point: the rise of William Pitt, Britain's new Secretary of State. Pitt understood what was at stake. He declared North America the key to global victory and poured resources into the colonies like never before. He sent tens of thousands of redcoats, offered to reimburse colonial governments for their contributions, and unleashed the full power of Britain's navy to choke French supply lines. Slowly, momentum shifted. The British captured Louisbourg in 1758, opening the St. Lawrence River and paving the way to Canada. They seized Fort Frontenac, severing French communication between Canada and Louisiana. Most symbolically, they took Fort Duquesne, the very stronghold where Washington had stumbled. The British renamed it Fort Pitt, and the city of Pittsburgh was born. These victories were not just military, they were psychological. Native allies, who had once fought with the French, began to reconsider. The French looked weaker, less capable of protecting their partners. Some tribes shifted toward neutrality. Others cautiously sided with Britain. Colonial militias, too, began to feel that perhaps victory was possible. The tide was turning, though no one yet knew just how dramatic the final outcome would be. The true climax of the war came in 1759 in the shadow of Quebec. Perched on cliffs high above the St. Lawrence, the city was the linchpin of French Canada. To take Quebec seemed impossible. For weeks, British forces under General James Wolfe bombarded the city, but its defenses held. Wolfe, bold and unorthodox, hatched a desperate plan. Under cover of darkness, his men would scale the cliffs at a seemingly impossible spot and confront the French on the plains of Abraham. On the night of September 12th, British troops rode silently upriver, then climbed the steep path. By dawn, thousands of redcoats stood in disciplined lines outside Quebec. French commander Marquis de Montcalm, shocked, chose to attack immediately rather than wait for reinforcements. The battle that followed was brief but decisive. British volleys shattered the French advance. Both Wolfe and Montcalm fell in the fighting, each mortally wounded, their deaths immortalized in paintings and legend. By day's end, Quebec had fallen. A year later, Montreal surrendered. France's empire in Canada was gone. With the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France ceded Canada to Britain and handed Louisiana to Spain. The entire map of North America was redrawn. In just a few short years, France's once vast dominion had vanished, and Britain stood triumphant. Yet that triumph came with a cost that would soon reshape history. At first glance, Britain seemed unstoppable after 1763. It had gained Canada, Florida, and undisputed dominance in North America. But the victory was hollow in many ways. The war had nearly doubled Britain's debt. To pay for it, Parliament turned to the colonies, reasoning that since the war had been fought to protect them, they should contribute to the costs. Taxes and regulations followed: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and others. Colonists, however, saw things differently. They believed they had already sacrificed. Many had fought, bled, and died during the war. Why should they now pay more to a distant government in which they had no voice? Resentment brewed. At the same time, native nations who had allied with France now faced a stark reality. Britain did not treat them as partners, but as obstacles. Settlers surged into the Ohio Valley, ignoring native claims. This led to Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, as a coalition of tribes struck back, capturing forts and attacking settlements. The rebellion shook British confidence and led to the proclamation of 1763, forbidding colonial settlement west of the Appalachians. Colonists, eager for land, bristled at this restriction, seeing it as yet another example of Britain dictating their future. Thus, in the wake of victory, Britain had alienated both its native neighbors and its colonial subjects. The seeds of future conflict had been sown. Looking back, the French and Indian War may seem like a distant sideshow to the Revolution, but in reality, it was the true beginning of America's story. It was in this conflict that George Washington first tasted command, failure, and resilience. It was in this war that colonial militias and British regulars fought side by side, learning both cooperation and deep mistrust. It was in this war that Britain's attempt to tighten control over its empire began, sparking the grievances that would explode in the 1770s. It was in this war that native nations realized European empires were less partners than conquerors. forcing them into ever more desperate struggles for survival. Without the French and Indian War, there might never have been a Stamp Act, a Boston Tea Party, or even a Declaration of Independence. This was more than a colonial border skirmish. It was the crucible that forged America. It made Britain the dominant empire of its age, but it also made rebellion, resistance, and revolution inevitable. When we talk about the birth of the United States, we cannot begin in 1776. We must begin here, in the forests of Pennsylvania, the cliffs of Quebec, and the battlefields of a forgotten war. So, what do you think? Was the French and Indian War truly the first act in America's revolutionary story, or would independence have come anyway, even without it? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below. I'd love to hear your take.